Hi everyone, my name is Kevin Perry. I'm an executive producer at Microsoft Studios. I run a small studio within Studios devoted to our legacy products like Age of Empires, Flight, and a few others. This talk is entitled Free to Play the Wrong Way, Age of Empires Online. It's not a post-mortem, partly because the game, of course, is still running, and also because, as I've grown to understand the process of picking apart what we did right and what we did wrong, it's a truism, of course, that you can't step in the same river twice. But I've also become to really understand that you can't take a snapshot of an online game. Online games can really only be understood over time. This particular talk, I've given 3 versions of it now. The first, about a year ago, to an internal audience at Microsoft, very triumphantly, because I thought we did everything right, the best we could possibly do. Then about 6 months ago or so at GDC in San Francisco, a little more tentatively, because I didn't like what some of the data was showing me. And now in revising it to present to you here today, I've come, I think, to really understand, at the moment, what we did right and what we did wrong and what we failed to do right that could have corrected some of the wrongs. So this isn't a post-mortem. It is, in some ways, a post-mortem of a post-mortem. In any event, like an online game, it's an ongoing conversation. So today, I'm going to talk to you about the story of Age of Empires Online. It's an MMORTS that we launched just about 2 years ago, in fact, precisely, as an okay game, but with a bad free-to-play business model. I'll identify the problems with the initial model, detail those proper fixes, and then show how we apply them to a live game. So we'll go through the business model, the design changes, population growth, all the same. Now note that I say detail the proper fixes. I'll actually talk about the fixes we made, and perhaps we can come to a discussion as a group whether we actually made the proper fixes or not. So just as a matter of analysis, just so everyone understands what I mean by an MMORTS, we took the basic RTS, a real-time strategy that Age of Empires is known for, StarCraft, Warcraft, Command and Conquer, you guys know these games. With Age in particular, you start on a random map, town center, villagers, resources, you build up an economy, you build up a military, and you go stomp out your enemies. We mix that in with an MMO model, really MMORPG, just to get some more acronyms out there, where in addition to just playing randomly, there were quests, you had a central city that you built up over time, and think of the civilizations as your characters. So you would level up your civ, get it better gear, send it on quests, get experience points, things like that, for those of you who aren't familiar with the game. So in the beginning, as I say, we launched almost precisely 2 years ago. In fact, Gamescom of 2011 was its official reveal. At the beginning, hey, it looked great. In fact, if you take that first day's data and extrapolate it all across the time, it would have been lovely. Started out pretty nicely, 100,000 daily active users, daily revenue was in a place where we were happy with it, and then it just fell right off a cliff. Until by December, we were down to 15 or so thousand daily active users and negligible daily revenue. Why? What happened? Why did it fall just instantly off the cliff? When it launched with not enough stuff. Insufficient content, missing features, and when you don't have enough to keep people sticky on the game, they're going to go away. So our daily active users just went away. A lot of people came in, tried the game, didn't like what they saw, and left. And we had a poor business model, meaning that we couldn't really even monetize the people that did stick around. So, of course, our revenues were down. And therefore, we got what everyone wants, the small and poorly monetized player base. I want to talk a minute about the insufficient content and missing features, what that really means. I don't want to go too far in depth here since not many people are making RTSs, but for purposes of illustration, because I think there's a larger point here. We launched with only 2 civilizations plus 1 booster for additional content. The player base, especially the people who are Age of Empires fans, felt that we were giving them nothing. They would come to us and say, hey, what's going on? For Age of Empires 3, you guys launched with 12 civs. For Age of Empires 2, which I can still buy for $10, by the way, you had 12 civs as well, plus 16, 18 with expansion packs. This was perceived as much, much less than everything else that we'd done before. That's not actually true. Those 2 civs that we launched with, Greeks and Egyptians, had, if you play through them, easily 20 to 30 hours of linear gameplay each, which is more than we'd launched with in any previous Age of Empires. Double, in fact. We didn't communicate that to anybody. And that's actually a fairly hard step to get over when you make a change that fundamental, but we didn't even make the attempt. Also, there was no skirmish mode. This is something that we're going to come back to on a bit more. Skirmish mode, for those who aren't familiar, it's a very popular low-time commitment mode where there's essentially no narrative content whatsoever. You just get your civ on a map, there's a couple of enemies, you just play for half an hour, whatever you'd like, just sitting down having fun with the game. We didn't have that at launch. Critically, that mode of gameplay, you don't need new content to enjoy. In fact, most of the ongoing legacy play we have, and we still have many, many fans logging many, many hours of Age of Empires 2, Age of Empires 3, and so on. That's their primary methodology of play. We didn't have that in at launch at all. Then, here's an example where our shifting models competed. To build the RPG, the MMO aspect of it, we've added in leveling, because everyone here knows or presumably familiar with that gear grind you get in World of Warcraft and other Deku state mods. So that was in the game, which is great if you are a certain kind of player, if you're a single player, must collect them all sort of player, and there's a lot of those out there. However, if you're a hardcore competitive PvP player, and there are many of those in the Age world as well, this felt like either grind to win or pay to win. So they hated it, hated it, hated it, hated it. And those PvP players, in a large brand where you have both PvE and PvP, your PvP players tend to be smaller in number, but they're very, very loud. And by their nature, they also tend to play multiplayer, obviously, so that expands their voice. So though, if we look at the data from one set of, hey, there are not that many guys, maybe we can afford to ignore the PvP set. Actually, their voice is much louder than the numbers would appear. Finally, we had a very slow leveling curve. This was a last-minute attempt to fix the fact that maybe we don't have enough content to keep people playing. Some of you maybe in this room may be familiar with that decision. And that, of course, just annoyed players. And it forced a repeat of already limited content already, since to grind to max level, we had no single core golden path all the way through quests to actually get to 40th level for the civs. You had to grind, especially in that dreaded last level tier. So, big surprise, the game wasn't ready to launch when it launched. Now, there's a certain lens you can look at this through, because we've all been told, those who've been studying free-to-play games for a while, that, hey, you don't have to have a complete game. You can launch with minimum viable content, right? Get a minimum playable out there, and then sort it out on the fly, and then players will flock to that afterwards. That may be true for certain kinds of games, but I can tell you it's not true for a large, especially branded title. You don't get a soft launch for a branded title, period. Because the people that come to you, that come there for your brand, feel betrayed, that it's not what their childhood or early adulthood memories give them. You only get word of mouth once. And we fought this very hard down the way. Some significant changes we made, and I'll talk a little bit later about some of our community strategies around that. But whenever we would succeed in attracting new players to the game, they always came in with the overhead of, but I heard this game sucks. I heard this game was pay to win. I heard this game doesn't have this and this and this. Months afterwards, when the game had all that, that was a hill that was extremely difficult to climb. So, the business model. Let's talk a minute on the business model. It was free to play. We launched with the Greeks and the Egyptians, which you could play for free. We had typical locks in there where you couldn't use certain gear, you couldn't use certain features, with a lot of those annoying little, hey, if you'd like to remove this feature, click this button to pay us. A model that I'm sure everyone here is familiar with. It was a very high price point. It was set at $20 per civ, $10 per booster, plus multipliers for those of you in Europe and elsewhere around the world. There was actually a giant step to get involved. Most of you now know, and I wish that we had known at the time, of course, one of the key elements for a free-to-play game is to get the player to buy in at a low level first to get over that initial hump. This is a pretty sizable chunk. Asking for somebody $20 right out of the gate when they may or may not like the game to begin with was difficult. And also most critically, from a free-to-play business model standpoint, the spending opportunity was capped. It was not possible to be a whale. Your max spend at launch was $50. If you got into the limited vanity items that we had on offer when we launched, some bushes you put in your capital city, you could spend at most $75, period. Absolutely period. And of course, everyone knows that revenue for free-to-play games depends upon those whales, depends upon some players that spend more than others. So we saw this as our biggest problem, and the one we moved to attack at first. So in summary, we built the core of a pretty good game. I don't want to knock the work that, I'm sorry, I should have said this to begin with. At Microsoft Studios, we're the publishers. The game was actually created by Robot Entertainment to begin with, and then our friends at Gas Powered Games took over development all the way through the end. There's a good game there. We didn't have the bells and whistles on. Frankly, there was a lot more missing than just bells and whistles. And we put it out in front of everybody. And we built a business model that predicated only on the sale of very expensive, slow-to-create content at a high price. That's fixable. It's a flaming wreck, but you can put out the fire and probably still drive it. But of course, the game is live. I wasn't able to say, all right, you know what, our bad, turn it off, come back in 6 months. All the fixes have to be done while the game is live. So what did we do? In December, which is when I joined the product, we began making those fixes. So here's a laundry list of stuff we needed to fix. We had limited content, no skirmish mode, gear-based PvP, grindy gameplay, high price point, limited spending opportunities, and a small player base. Just a couple things to fix. So let's look at the easy thing. I lowered the price point, chopped it right in half. $10 to buy in, $5 for the boosters, move on from there. Now, the revenue actually did not change from the game. That's straight economics 101. When we half the price and demand remained the same, we got double the revenue. In hindsight, that was actually probably a mistake. I'd highly recommend, I don't think she's speaking here at this conference. I've seen some other Congregate people, but Emily Greer from Congregate has done some excellent work on price points in free-to-play games. Please seek out her work and look at it. When you discount things permanently in this way, you present the idea to your player base that it wasn't worth that to begin with. Not only do you piss off everybody that bought it at 20, because you're always going to find somebody who bought it the day before you turn off the price, but you send the message that the content isn't worth very much when you do so. It's a much better thing to do to work on sales and other elements of changing the price. Anyway, see Emily Greer's work on that. Had I do this over again, I wouldn't have done this given the other things that we did. Now the medium fixes. So, hey, not enough content. We put out 2 new civs. Our sales and daily active users spiked every time we put out a new civ. We had to get skirmish mode out there. We created skirmish mode and actually released it for free for a limited time first, just to try and get some goodwill back. Added a new PvP mode that didn't involve gear at all. So hopefully silencing some of the PvP critics. Overhauled the XP, gave people more to do, so the grind was gone. All the things that were released for free, got positive reviews out of them. To attack the small player base, we did 2 things. One is we launched on Steam instead of only on Games Windows Live as it was originally. And that was a big, big boost, as you'll see in the player numbers I'm going to show you in a moment. Tripled the daily active users, huge revenue spike. That got more eyes on the game than anything else we've done. And we overhauled the way we handled the community. I've got a few slides on this later. I'm a huge believer in the way that you maintain your community is the way you maintain your free-to-play game. And that doubled their base and engagement along the way as well. But the limited spending thing was still, I believe, the thorn in our side, and that's what took the longest to fix. So we completely overhauled the economy in the game in June of last year. This, I felt, was our biggest opportunity, certainly, to lift our sagging revenue. Our daily active users was completely driven by really major expensive content releases. So we released a new Civ, spiked the DAU, but they didn't stick around. We could not create those civs fast enough. Remember, these civs are 30 to 40 hours of single-player gameplay through. It took a lot of time and effort to make every one of those civs. We couldn't make them fast enough to keep the DAU high enough. We did have a small but dedicated player base. So the last thing I wanted to do was, while trying to get everything else above board, piss them off. I didn't want to make a huge change in the economy, a particularly punishing change in the economy, to lose the few players we had. So how do I get monetization increase without alienate them? So that launched, as I said earlier, in June. So as a reminder, before June, we had limited paid downloaded content, purchasable on Games When It's Live or Steam, but in sharply limited amounts. In other words, again, the maximum of $75 right there. After the change, oh, and of course, since we were launching in a retail environment, which Steam is, we launched for the whole package at $16 and later at $30, just to take the loss lead to get some users in. After the changeover, we added a number of categories. At that point, we had 4 civs. They were still $10 each. We added another booster, skirmish along the way. And we had city vanity before, just vanity items you bought to make your city a little prettier. But we'd added in dressing your little units. Hundreds of possible little transactions on making your guy, putting cool stuff on your guys, funny stuff and cool stuff. City consumables, which looked at another way, were ways to increase your experience gain and other elements, gold gain at your city, since your city is your character. And mission consumables. Basically, this was a little bit from the single-player PvE only pay-to-win buttons for convenience, which we also tried to make cool. Instead of just giving you extra troops, you got like 5 crocodiles or an elephant stampede or fun things like that. So now we had no maximum spend. Now, nothing that we added here, by the way, is anything earth-shattering or new. It's all standard free-to-play fare that many of you are familiar with. We ended up reinventing the wheel in a number of ways. Now, for those of you that have thought about this more than I had at the time, you may have noted there's actually a big warning sign here, but we'll come back to later when I discovered it. This is a big, big change. It wasn't just adding more stuff in the store. We also changed the game fully into a true internal currency model. Single currency, not dual currency. There was no soft currency of the game, only hard currency. Actually, that's not true. I'm sorry. There's no hard currency, just soft currency. Empire points. You earned Empire points by playing at a very generous rate, and also if you wanted to speed things up, we gave you the ability to buy those points. That truly converted for the first time the game into a truly free-to-play game where you could exchange time or money for progress in the game. We had a lot of wins from that. We got a little bit of a relaunch. The press story was good. PC Gamer changed our rating from 65 to 90, so thank you, PC Gamer. We had a great community reaction out of that. The players who were still with us loved it, absolutely loved it, and did bring in some additional more through word of mouth. And, of course, we had a larger player base overall, because when you actually change that truly free-to-play model, of course, it opens up the funnel at the top. Also, as a side note, operationally very important for those of you that may be dealing with massive bureaucracies in the way that you handle your revenue stream. Changing that was much easier for us internally, because then the store, which had to have prior dozens of items in it, only had 5. The set of currency items we had, the $1, $3, $5, $10, $15 elements. That's much, much easier to run, because we could then change all the stuff in the store. If we want to put something on sale after that, it was all internal to the game, as opposed to having to negotiate with Valve or negotiate with Games When It's Live or anyone like that. Kept the agility back internally. Most of you, hopefully, are working a far more agile element than I was at the time. So what happened to all that? So we broke the concept of the game back down to basics in terms of economy and relaunched it, essentially. So after the first month, so this was revenue sales running down through here, and this is the revenue line after the free-to-play change. In other words, the first 5 weeks of the new model had revenue equal to 15 weeks of the old model. Same player base, since we didn't attract new players with this, tripled the revenue. So I felt pretty darn good at this point. I thought, hey, look at that. Here's what we did. It actually did, again, no surprise to many of you here that have studied this, when you make a game properly free to play and give people an unlimited opportunity to spend, they will do so. Let's look at the internal economy a little bit more here, too. I apologize for the difficulty of reading this number. This is several months in the life of the game. EP being our Empire points. The number, what I was looking at here was the number of EP that were bought as opposed to the number of EP that were earned, because that's, of course, with a single currency model, very important for you to maintain the faucet on, and how are players spending them. You can see spikes. So the green is the EP spent. And yeah, a red is earned. I'll talk a little bit later why you see a monthly spike in this. One of the elements that we added to the game I'll talk about briefly later in terms of an elder game was something called alliances. That as players who had their level 40 civs that didn't have anything else to do with them, similar to raiding in a MMORPG, all the effort that they expended on a monthly basis was put into a large pot. And there were 3 separate factions fighting, and every month we gave out rewards based upon which faction had done well. So it was a trickle back into the game to keep the game sticky. There were daily, weekly, and monthlies. Very well designed. Got to give props to Gas Powered on that. And so you can see that there were big spikes of spending every time, but of course spikes of earning. So part of the problem with this was eventually, at the beginning, 70% of the EP, the soft currency, was bought. That dropped to 55% or so when I last read in May of last year, and it's now actually below 50%. So that could be tuned out later. We were initially very generous with the currency we gave out because we needed to win players back. And it's failing to clear at 3%. Basically, people are accumulating more and more EP. Partly that's because some players, of course, that gain EP leave the system for an unknown amount of time. If they leave the game, it just sits there, and I can't tell the difference between if you have 10,000 EP in your account and you've left the game permanently, and you have 10,000 EP in your account, but you're going to come back next summer. I can't tell that, but I know that the stored currency in the game is getting a little bit scary, too much high. The only reliable drain you can see here in this spike was when we released a civ. Releasing a new civ would get people to clear out their inventory. So looking closely at what people were spending that on, you can see here, civs and boosters were still the majority of what they were spending on. Everything marked under new, though, the new consumables, the vanity gear, warehouses, which was a convenience feature we put in, blueprints. So 38% of EP purchases, nearly 40% of the economy was going to something that had not existed before we did the turnover. I thought, again, that was great. Probably shouldn't have opened that bottle of champagne. I want to talk a little bit more also about some of the design changes that we implemented as well. We did not design the game to monetize. Not unintentionally, we didn't know how not to monetize, particularly at this point in time, but it was a conscious choice. We designed to engage. Our entire goal is keeping players playing the game. The more people play the game, assuming that they still have opportunities to buy in, the more of them will buy in over time. They'll vest their interest in the game itself. We didn't force players to do anything. You can still today play the game completely free to play. You have to have a lot of patience, but everything in it is earnable. You can spend time with a free civ and put in probably the last numbers I saw were 14 to 15 hours on average to get enough EP to buy the civ outright. And from there you can level up all your civs. I mentioned alliances earlier to promote the in-game engagements. We also put in something called milestones, which are incentives to buy other civs. So as you level up your civs at levels 5, 10, 15, 20, you get bonuses that are only applicable to other civs. So even if you did level the Greeks all the way up to 40, you were then sitting on this pile of benefits that could only be applied if you bought another civ. I say bought, earn, or buy. We added a number of PvP-focused features to try and keep the PvP people handy, observer mode, elements like that. And also added some feature-level conveniences. One of the nice things about launching in a half-baked state was there was a lot of quality of life missing from the game, so we added it back in. We were careful not to do so in a punishing way. Anything we added back in for convenience, there was always a low-level free version. Our detractors, of course, say that, of course you did that. You know, the first one's free, right? You know, got to get us hooked. Well, actually, I felt strongly that, for example, the Empire Vault is one of those elements that we allowed, that actually makes it easier to transfer items from one civ to another. It's a flaw in the game. It should have been in there from the beginning. We gave 4 slots for free. Again, it's something that should have been in the game to begin with, so have it for free. If you want 10, 20, 32 slots, go ahead, we'll take some money for that. That was one of our bigger sellers for a while. But I didn't want to paper over what had been an oversight in the original design by trying to monetize it too much. Anyway, so that's the business model and design changes, which looked initially, as I say, to have done pretty well. I did still have a problem, though, and the population of the game was still too low. You got 2 basic things you can do when you're trying to manage population. Not grow, just manage a population to begin with. You can grow it, or you can maintain the people you have already. To grow, as most people know, you got to have a pretty big marketing spend. You got to get PR traction so that when you start putting out stories, people understand and listen to what you're saying. You have to have discoverability, search engine optimization. A good brand always helps. People have to be able to find your game. Whereas to maintain a population, you need constant content releases. How many in here have quit playing an online game because there weren't enough content updates? Polish, quality of life, very important. Not directly monetizable, but again, annoyances drive people away. And you have to engage actively. Community engagement is very important, both players with players and your team with players. So at launch, of course, our growth ability was very high because we had a big marketing spend, big launch at Gamescom, et cetera. And our ability to maintain the population when we launched was very low because we had very little polish, very little quality of life, and so on. After the launch, however, we had no real ability to grow. I had no marketing spend. A lot of the PR, the well had already been poisoned already because, hey, why not? The game isn't very good. Discoverability did remain fairly high for us. Therefore, we decided to focus on maintenance. Now here's a population graph of our DAU from launch all the way through some period through. You can see the trend through here. So in November, we launched the Persians, which we launched also for a while a version of civs called pro civs as opposed to full-on civs. The pro civs were civs that lacked a lot of the single-player PvE content. So they started at level 20. The level range was 40, so it gave you a leg up. They're primarily intended for PvP play and for variety. Didn't move the needle too much, or at that point, as I saw, it didn't really arrest the slide. In January, released a skirmish pack for free. Didn't move very much. Price drop, didn't change it. Launch on Steam, which we combined with the launch of a new civ, the Celts, gave us our biggest spike ever, almost back up to our launch numbers. And then we released the new business model, as I said, June. It's July in these numbers here, since it was late June. We had a 13% monthly active user rise when we changed the economy. But then the numbers dropped away again. So again, that's a warning sign that I should have seen more. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. I do want to talk for a moment about community. In interest of time, I'm not going to talk here as much of it as I'd like. I have lots of talks I give on community. But in a game as a service, everyone understands the importance of servers, right? If your ops team isn't working very well, if a server goes down, no one can play your game. If your community team goes down, if the community of your game sours and breaks, no one will play your game. Community management is as important as server ops. It's vitally important, looked at over time to understand that. We chose and took a different approach. I'm not going to talk specifically about it, as I said, I can do talks on that, where we actually adopted what we called transparency, where we openly told the player base what we were doing and why. and promised to tell them within limits. I mean, we're still Microsoft. I couldn't show a lot of numbers, couldn't show a lot of figures, but why we were doing things. Why did I do that? Aside from my ethical belief as a member of many online communities, that's the way more online communities should behave, I had no marketing budget. None. The only way I could attract new players to the game was by getting the community to word of mouth, be outreach. So I actually converted most of our community coordinators to outreach coordinators, essentially. For example, forums were very, very important to us. Most games have the ability to direct mail their players. For example, I played EVE Online for about a month, I want to say 7 years ago maybe, and I still get a monthly email from the CCP guys. Thanks, guys. I do read it, so it's not wasted. I couldn't do that with Age Online because Microsoft is extremely concerned about personal privacy information. I didn't know who they were. I could not, I know that sounds funny, but it is actually true internally, I promise you. I could not email the players. I do not know the email address of the players who play the game, and I have no method of collecting it. So the only way that we could reach the players was through the launcher. That's guaranteed to launch the game. Of course, I can't bring people back. They can only read the launcher when they see it. So we chose our forums as the primary method of communicating with the players. We drove players there by telling them interesting, relevant information in the blogs. Part of the transparency element is giving that bit of secrecy. Oh, didn't you hear? The developer said this is going to change then, and that drives more people back. We have about 10% of our user base regularly using the forums, which is a very, very high number for official forums. And we exposed our forum elements on a lot of our other social media elements. For example, we didn't engage people on Facebook, and we did engage people on Facebook, but not to stay on Facebook. We started pushing them back. Every post on the Facebook page said, hey, come to the blog, come to the forums to work that out. Same thing with Reddit, same thing with Pinterest, everything else moving on from there. So anyway, as I say, it's a bit of an aside, but the reason why it's important is that highly engaged community is much, much more monetizable. We had poor discoverability. I couldn't get new players in very easily, and we couldn't communicate with our current customers. We have to engage them with community tactics, and you can see that where that helped. So, we fixed the business model, revamped the design, and kept strong community involvement throughout. Now what? So here's that population graph I showed you up through July when we changed the business model. The next thing we did was release a new Civ, the Norse, in October. Nothing. Now, this is population graph. Our revenue graph spiked as people bought it, and then they wandered away. So again, we got some good sales, but no sustainable player spike out of it. So at this point, I became quite concerned. The only thing I'd had, the only lever I had to pull at all was adding new content. And all of a sudden, that lever wasn't working anymore. Why? And this, helpfully labeled, is the most important slide of the talk. Existing players, that made the existing players happy. They had finished everything we had to offer, or at least everything we wanted to play that we had to offer. They want deeper features. They want more polish. They want more content. That same more content, so here's an analogy. So at that point, we're up to 6 civs. If you'd heard about Age of Empires Online, at launch, someone could easily say to you, oh, well, yeah, you say, well, it sucks, right? It's only got 2 civs, and your friend can say, no, it's got 6 now, it's fine. That's good. 7, 8, 9, what's the difference? At some point, once the game becomes fully featured, you cannot add features to it that will bring new players in. They've already tried, they liked it or didn't like it. So adding more of the same kept our existing player base happy. It's not a bad thing to do, but I couldn't bring in new people based on that. And then, unfortunately, I came to the real realization that, like Yossarian in the back of the plane, I was treating Snowden for the wrong wound. The business model, though it needed to be fixed, wasn't the problem. The production model was the problem. Our production model, where the only method I had of driving sales, of driving user engagement, was new civs that are great, good value for the price, 34 hours of content for $10, or earn along the way, great stuff. But it was costing me hundreds of thousands of dollars for each one of those. The production model was unsupportable, no matter how good the business model was. I could have raised my revenue by 8 or 9 times and barely broke even. The content itself was too expensive to create. So the new content we added, here's an example. An MMORPG does not release a new expansion pack that just consists of a new class that you then go through all your old content with. That's attractive to some, but only if they are completionists, only if they've done everything all the way through. When you release a giant new content pack, it would be better. The better thing I should have done, rather than release 2 or 3 new civs, would have been to bite the bullet and go back and add 10 more levels to all existing civs. I didn't do that because that was too expensive, but it was the right thing to do in terms of keeping the player base actively engaged, because a tremendous number of people had finished the game. It didn't want to go through the same old content with a slightly different variation. That would have brought people back. Again, new features, whether it's quality or simple convenience, doesn't tend to attract new players. It helps keep your existing one. It's very sticky, but does little to attract new players. Now, back in the dark ages, when we all made games that actually sat in a box on a retail shelf somewhere, working out the budget for the production budget for your game was actually fairly simple. So you'd say, okay, I need X number of dollars to make this game. You're usually wrong, but still. And then the sales guys would take a map of the world and go out for a 3-martini lunch and come back and say what they thought the game would sell, and you work those 2 numbers out together. Fairly straightforward. That hasn't changed. You still need to balance the cost of production of your content versus the players that bring it in. But the trouble is, it's not simple X compared to Y. Now I'm looking at everything we're doing forward, what's my man-hour production cost versus the player hour I expect out of it, average player hour. And that's a very complex number because it moves on both ends. So everyone's probably familiar with the ARPDAU, the average revenue per daily active user. So now I'm throwing an MH on the front of that, and it's getting confusing. But I really have to think of it that way, because if I'm spending too much money making the content, doesn't matter how good the content is, doesn't matter how good the business model is, there's a hole in the bottom of the boat. So we talked about the business model and design changes, the population growth strategies, the results of the above. I talked a little bit about the hindsight earlier, and I'll finish up with this. So I picked out, when going back over these slides again, 3 critical places where I should have said, whoa, 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 wait a second. This is not going where I thought it's going. So all the gameplay activity the players were actually doing, forget what they were buying, forget what they were telling us on the forums, what they were actually doing most of the time when playing was building up a civ. This is the core part of the gameplay. It's not wrong, that was what the intent was. That's not unlimited. So there is a functional ceiling on the number of vanity of course is limited by your own patience, like how much you like dressing up little figures. But the XP boosters, the gold boosters, and so on were only useful to level a civ. They weren't useful once you had a civ. That's not entirely true because of the way the alliances work. Players could spend money to have their alliance increase, but of course that actually is a net, evens out, or if they spend money because you're giving them EP for that. So I thought we were setting up an unlimited gameplay element. We weren't. You were just leveling civs. And the more civs we gave you, hey, the more stuff you could use that again. But again, the civs are too expensive to use. I was thrilled that, hey, after the change, 30% of the spending was on new stuff that we hadn't had before. That was backwards, entirely backwards. 62% of the spending was on the stuff that was too expensive to make. And hey, vanity's nice. You'll make 15 to 25% off of vanity no matter what you're doing, it looks like these days, but you can't sustain an entire game off of it. And finally, releasing the new content we made, we spent a lot of time and effort crafting this high quality good stuff, which I'm very proud of, by the way, It didn't permanently affect the player population, the spending habits. In fact, our daily active user count right now, which is a little, say it's around 12,000 daily active users a day, has been the same since we released the last Civ in November of last year, has been the same since we announced in January that we weren't making any more content. So I thought the number one thing that would kill your daily actives is say, all right, guys, we're done. Hey, we're keeping the servers up, but we're not making any more content for you. Thanks for playing. Please come and play. Still, same number of players. And actually, looking back, that's the number of players roughly that we had when we tumbled down off the launch cliff. The game has reached a steady state. There are 11 to 12,000 people per day who want to play this game, almost regardless of what we do. I'm not saying we have a lack of responsibility to them. I mean, there are players, we love them and want to keep them happy. But at some point, the game falls to a steady state. So we've known for a while, through a lot of excellent postmortems at GDCs and other places, that you can recover from a disastrous technical launch sometimes. Some games can have, oh my God, the servers don't work. Many of the biggest and most famous games out there have had elements of that. You can come back from that. And lots of games have changed business models entirely with mixed results. I think the business model changes we made to Age Online were correct for the large part. I thought fixing the business model was all that was needed. I was wrong. It was necessary, but not sufficient. We did a lot of things right, but there weren't enough to save the active production of the game. Changing the production model is the only thing that could have. Dense, single-use, expensive content was what was actually broken to begin with. I have time for questions, and if you'd like to ask a question, I think we may have a mic in the back. If not, just stand up. Please state your name, and we got a mic mic's coming from the back, and I'll repeat the question. Anyone? All right, thank you very much. Wait. We do have a question.
Thank you. Hello, Shaban Shame from Everdreamsoft. From your final words, if you had to start again Age of Empire Online, what would you change at the beginning, or how would you imagine the perfect game for?
The perfect game, so the question was, if I had to start the whole thing again, if I were making Age of Empires Online 2, let's say, how would I change the elements now? I would look very carefully at production cost and time players spend in the game. For example, skirmish mode we launched without. A new game I would envision would be largely based around skirmish mode. There's a lot of value in skirmish mode. It's not a cheap or terrible way to play the game. As I say, it's the majority of the way that people play the game. I would approach single-player quest content similar, let's say, to cinematics. Cinematics probably have the worst ROI of anything in our industry, right? Most people view them a couple of times. You can easily spend millions on those things. They're necessary to make the game feel like a big piece of work, but is it the best use of your time? So how I would separate things out is build the base core of the game that was sustainable in a non-relatively light content way, and then see what players are interested in and try something out and say, okay, here's a 10-level expansion pack for those that want to level up through quests, and see how that did.
Hello, this is Fabio. I have a question about the players and what you have learned about the players. Would you say that the players that played Age of Empires before are the same type of players that are playing Age of Empires online right now?
So the question was, are the type of players the same that were Age of Empires fans before and Age of Empires Online? The answer is it's actually a mix. The brand is powerful because a lot of people remember playing Age of Empires Online. Often we have second and in some cases now third generation players who were playing with their parents before. So a lot of people came in the door because of their love for the Age of Empires brand. Whether they stayed or didn't stay was depending upon whether they liked the new method of playing, because it really does play. I mean, the basic minute-to-minute gameplay is very similar. In fact, a lot of ways advanced on some of the prior Age of Empires Online. But the trappings, the MMORPG elements, both excited players who were used to that from other things and drove some away, but also brought in new players, which was the hope. is that people that were used to the MMO elements of things also came in to try the game. So not as many as I would have liked, honestly. The marketing for the game was actually based more on bringing in the broad base as opposed to speaking to the core. Had I to do it over again, I would prefer to speak to the core a little more strongly. You do, I think, in general, annoy your core at your own peril. At some point, the conference will be sending around an email evaluation form to everyone. Please fill it out honestly. I'll read all the comments. Thank you very much.